September 17, 1944. A 22-year-old machine gunner named Thomas Cotton Jones stepped onto the volcanic sand of Peleliu Island carrying 60 pounds of equipment, a photograph of his high school sweetheart tucked inside his helmet, and a small leather diary he'd promised to keep for her. Within hours, he would vanish into the chaos of what military historians now call one of the most brutal and unnecessary battles of the Pacific War. His body would be recovered, his personal effects scattered, but the diary, that small leather book containing his final thoughts, his fears, his love, would disappear as if it had never existed. For 70 years, Laura Mae Davis lived without closure. She married an Army Air Corps man in 1945, built a life, raised children, but never forgot the boy who wrote her letters in neat handwriting about coming home to Indiana. She never knew that on his last day alive, Cotton Jones had written 8 words that would change everything historians thought they knew about what really happened on that blood-soaked beach. She never knew because the diary had vanished, lost somewhere in the Pacific, buried under coral and sand, or so everyone believed. Then, in 2013, a phone call came to an elderly woman in Mooresville, Indiana. The voice on the other end was from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. They had something that belonged to her, something impossible. After 70 decades of silence, Cotton Jones was about to speak again. The curator's hands trembled slightly as she opened the storage box. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper, was a diary so damaged by time and battle that it seemed miraculous it had survived at all. The leather cover was stained dark. Whether from seawater, blood, or volcanic ash, no one could say for certain. Pages were stuck together, others were missing entirely, torn away by forces unknown. But there, on the inside cover, faded but legible, was an inscription that made the curator's breath catch. To Cotton, so you remember every moment until you come home to me. All my love, Laura Mae. Christmas, 1943. The diary should not have existed. Every expert who examined it said the same thing. The conditions it endured should have destroyed it completely. Salt water, tropical heat, humidity that rotted steel, volcanic ash that contained enough sulfur to eat through fabric and leather. Yet here it was, decades after the battle, recovered from a location the museum would only describe as a private collection that wished to remain anonymous. The vagueness of this explanation would later fuel speculation, conspiracy theories, questions about what the military knew and when they knew it. But in that moment, standing in the museum's conservation lab, the staff had only one thought. How do we tell her? Laura Mae Davis Burlingame was 90 years old when she received the call. She had buried her first love in her heart for 70 decades, built a new life, loved again, raised children, but never forgot the boy with the shy smile who worked at his father's garage and dreamed of coming home to open his own shop. She had given him that diary 3 months before he shipped out, hoping he would fill it with mundane details, descriptions of islands she'd never heard of, complaints about the food, stories about his buddies, things that would make him seem close even across an ocean. She never expected him to document his own death. The museum flew her to New Orleans. They wanted to prepare her, to explain what they'd found, to manage expectations about the diary's condition, but nothing could prepare her for the moment they placed it in her hands. The weight of it, lighter than she remembered. The smell, musty and chemical from preservation efforts. The feel of the leather, no longer supple but dried and cracked like ancient parchment. She opened it carefully, guided by conservators wearing white gloves, and began to read words written by a hand she once knew as well as her own. The early entries were innocent. Boot camp at Camp Lejeune, complaints about sergeants who yelled too much, jokes about the food, descriptions of his buddies, boys from farms and cities who'd become his brothers. He wrote about missing her, about the photograph he kept in his helmet, and about plans for after the war. A small house, nothing fancy, 2 kids, maybe 3. A garage where he could work on cars and not have to answer to anyone. Simple dreams that seemed impossibly distant as he wrote them from a troop ship crossing the Pacific. But as the pages progressed, something changed. The handwriting became more urgent, less careful. The entries grew darker. He mentioned things that didn't appear in any official record. Training exercises that went wrong. Men dying in accidents that were never reported. Orders that didn't make sense. A growing sense that something about their mission wasn't right.
August 1944. Camp Pavuvu in the Russell Islands. Cotton Jones and the men of the 1st Marine Division prepared for an invasion that military intelligence promised would be quick. 4 days, they were told, maybe a week at most. Peleliu was a small coral island, barely 6 miles long, held by a Japanese garrison that aerial reconnaissance suggested was demoralized and weak. The island had an airfield the Americans needed, and taking it would be, in the words of one briefing officer, a straightforward operation. Cotton's diary entries from Pavuvu reveal something the official records don't. Doubt. Not about courage or capability, but about the intelligence itself. He wrote about conversations with veterans who'd been at Tarawa, at Saipan, at Guam. Men who'd learned that Japanese positions were never as weak as headquarters claimed. Men who'd walked into what was supposed to be light resistance and found fortified nightmares. The guys who've been in it before don't buy the 4-day story, Cotton wrote on August 20th. They've heard it before. They say the Japs don't quit. They say when intelligence calls something easy, start writing your letters home. The training on Pavuvu was brutal. Temperatures reached 120 degrees. The coral dust got into everything, eyes, throats, equipment. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion during maneuvers. But the worst part, according to Cotton's diary, was the feeling that they were training for the wrong battle. The practice landings assumed light opposition on the beaches. The tactical briefings focused on quickly securing the airfield and moving inland. Everything was designed for speed, for the quick victory intelligence promised. But on September 4th, just 11 days before the invasion, Cotton recorded something that wouldn't appear in any official history for decades. A meeting that technically never happened. A conversation that was never supposed to reach the lower ranks. He wrote about a sergeant, a man he identified only as Mac, who'd been pulled into a briefing with regimental intelligence. Mac came back to the company area after midnight, drunk, which was unusual, because Mac never drank. He gathered a small group of men, Cotton among them, and told them something that would haunt Cotton's final entries. Mac said they know, Cotton wrote, his handwriting shaky, different from his usual careful script. The smart boys know it's not going to be 4 days. They've got new photos, new intelligence. The Japs have been digging in for months. Caves, tunnels, positions we can't hit from the air. Mac said one of the intelligence officers told him off the record that we should expect 40% casualties in the first week. 40%! That's almost half of us gone. But they're not changing the plan. They're not telling the men. Mac said they need us to go in confident, not scared. He said they're sacrificing accuracy for morale. The next day's entry was short. I don't know if Mac was telling the truth or if the booze was talking. I want to believe he's wrong. I have to believe he's wrong. But I keep thinking about those Tarawa guys and how they look when they talk about the landing. Like they've seen something they can't unsee. I'm writing this down because if Mac is right, someone should know. Someone should know we knew something was wrong before we ever hit that beach.
September 10th, 1944, 5 days before the invasion. The diary entries became more personal, more urgent. Cotton wrote letters within the diary, passages addressed directly to Laura Mae that he never intended to mail, things too raw, too honest for the censors to allow through, things he needed to say but couldn't send across the ocean. Laura, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back to tear these pages out like I planned. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you have to read these words instead of hearing me say them. I'm sorry I won't be there to open that garage we talked about. I'm sorry our kids won't exist. I'm sorry for all the moments we won't have. But I need you to know that every moment I did have, the good ones, the ones that mattered, you were in all of them. Even before I knew you, somehow you were there, like I was always walking toward you. He wrote about fear, not the abstract fear of death, but specific terrors that kept him awake. The fear of drowning in his equipment before reaching the beach. The fear of being wounded and left behind. The fear of dying badly, screaming, crying, not brave. The fear that his last thoughts wouldn't be noble or poetic, just animal panic. Everyone talks about dying for your country, he wrote. Nobody talks about how you'll probably die confused and scared, wondering what went wrong, why this is happening, wanting your mother. September 12th. 3 days out. The naval bombardment of Peleliu had begun. From the troop ships, the men could see the island on the horizon, see the explosions, feel the concussion of battleship guns through the deck. The bombardment was supposed to be devastating, supposed to eliminate Japanese resistance. Cotton recorded what the men around him were saying. Some believed it, some wanted to believe it. Others just stared at the island and said nothing. "We watched the island burn all day," Cotton wrote. "The whole thing looked like it was on fire. The officers say nothing could survive what we're throwing at them. But I keep thinking about what Max said, about the caves, about how they're underground where the shells can't reach. I keep thinking about how quiet everyone got when we saw the island, like we all know something we're not saying out loud, like we're all writing letters in our heads we hope nobody ever reads." September 14th, 1 day before landing. The final entry before Peleliu. Cotton's handwriting here was different again, smaller, more controlled, like he was forcing himself to be calm. He wrote about the men in his unit, described each one, their hometowns, their quirks, their dreams. "If I don't make it, and somehow this gets back to someone who cares, these are the guys I was with. Remember their names. They deserve to be remembered." Then he wrote about the machine gun. He was a gunner and a weapons platoon, which meant he'd carry a .30 caliber Browning machine gun, 47 pounds of steel and wood that would be his responsibility, his weapon, his burden. "The gun weighs almost as much as Laura Mae," he wrote. "I practiced with it today, one last time, loading, clearing, firing. The instructor kept saying, 'Treat it like your best friend. It's the only thing that will keep you alive.' But all I could think was how heavy it is, how heavy it's going to be on that beach, how I'm going to be slower than everyone else because of it, how if something goes wrong, I can't just run." The final paragraph of that entry, the last words Cotton Jones wrote before landing, has become one of the most quoted passages from any World War II diary. Not because it was eloquent or poetic, but because it was so utterly, devastatingly human. "Tomorrow morning we hit the beach. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I'll be brave. I don't know if the gun will work, or if I'll freeze up, or if I'll do everything right and still die anyway. I just know that I'm more scared than I've ever been, and I'm not allowed to show it." If you find this diary, Laura Mae, if you're reading these words, it means I didn't make it back to burn this page like I should. It means the worst thing happened. But please know that my last thoughts were of you, that your face was the last good thing I thought about, that if there's anything after this, I'll be waiting for you at that garage we talked about, the one that doesn't exist, in the future we won't have. I love you. I'm sorry. Please give it to Laura Mae Davis, the girl he loved. That was September 14th, 1944. The next page in the diary was torn, damaged beyond recovery. Then nothing. Blank pages. Water damage. Something that might have been blood. And then, impossibly, inexplicably, one more entry. One final page that shouldn't exist. September 17th, 1944. Written in a hand that was barely recognizable as Cotton's. Shaky, desperate, wrong. The conservators at the National World War II Museum debated for 3 weeks whether to show Laura Mae this page. The paper was different from the rest of the diary, coarser, like it had been exposed to extreme heat. The ink was smeared, mixed with something that tests suggested was a combination of seawater and volcanic ash. But it was Cotton's handwriting, distorted by circumstance but unmistakably his. The formation of the letters, the way he crossed his T's, the peculiar loop in his capital L. Handwriting analysis confirmed it with 94% certainty. But the content made no sense. September 17th was the day of the landing. H hour was 0830.
The Amtraks, those lumbering amphibious tractors, hit the beach at Peleliu under a wall of Japanese fire that intelligence had promised wouldn't exist. Within the first hour, 60% of the first wave was killed or wounded. The beach became a killing ground, a nightmare of fire and coral and screaming men. Machine gun positions that aerial reconnaissance had missed opened up from caves. Artillery that was supposed to have been destroyed by the naval bombardment rained shells on the landing zones. The Amtraks, designed to crawl over the coral reef and onto the beach, became floating coffins. Cotton Jones was in the third wave. His Amtrak took fire 400 yards from shore. According to the official casualty report filed by his company commander 3 days later, Corporal Thomas P. Jones was killed by enemy fire while approaching the beach. His body was recovered that evening and buried in a temporary cemetery on the island, later exhumed and repatriated. Purple Heart awarded posthumously. Next of kin notified October 3, 1944. So how did he write a diary entry on the beach? The entry itself was brief, maybe 60 words, but those words would spark decades of questions. Made it to the coral. Can't move forward. Jimmy hit. Martinez hit. Guns jammed. Water red. They're in the caves. Mac was right. They knew. This isn't 4 days. This is Tarawa again. Worse. The lieutenant is dead. We're pinned. I can see the airfield. So close. Laura, I'm... The sentence ended there. Just stopped, mid-thought, mid-word. The rest of the page was blank, except for what looked like a fingerprint in dried blood near the bottom corner. Type O positive. Cotton's blood type. When Laura Mae saw this page, she asked the question that everyone wanted to ask, but nobody had articulated. If he died on the beach, who recovered the diary? The museum had no answer. The official records showed Cotton's personal effects were collected and inventoried: dog tags, one photograph badly damaged, fragments of letters, no diary mentioned. His parents received a box 3 months after his death. Wedding ring he'd carried for Laura Mae, the photograph barely recognizable, a few letters, but no diary. When his mother asked about it, she was told personal diaries often didn't survive combat conditions. She accepted this. What choice did she have? So where had it been for 70 years? The museum's official position was vague to the point of uselessness. The diary came to us through a private collector who wished to remain anonymous. The collector indicated it was purchased from an estate sale of a World War II veteran who had served in the Pacific. We cannot provide more specific provenance information due to donor confidentiality agreements. But this explanation created more questions than it answered. What veteran had kept it? Why hadn't he returned it to Cotton's family? Had he known Cotton? Was he there on the beach? And most disturbing, had the diary been deliberately withheld?
A retired Marine Corps historian named Dr. Richard Chen spent 6 months investigating the diary's provenance after the museum made it public in 2014. What he discovered wasn't a clear answer, but a trail of deliberate obscurity that suggested someone had worked very hard to keep the diary's journey hidden. The anonymous collector, Chen learned through persistent investigation, was actually a dealer in military memorabilia based in San Diego. When pressed, the dealer admitted he'd purchased the diary in 2011 from the estate of a man named Walter Hoskins, a Navy Corpsman who'd served at Peleliu. Hoskins had died at age 89, never married, no children. His belongings were sold to settle debts. Among boxes of uniforms, medals, and photographs was a small leather diary that the estate sale company had almost thrown away due to its damaged condition. But here's where it got strange. Hoskins wasn't just any corpsman. He'd been assigned to the beach on D-Day, September 15th, specifically to treat casualties as they came off the Amtraks. His unit was positioned exactly where Cotton Jones' wave landed. Chen found Hoskins' own war diary, donated to a different museum years earlier, and in it was a single line dated September 17th that made his blood run cold. Retrieved personal effects from unrecoverable KIA on coral outcrop. 5 items, including diary. Could not evacuate body due to position and ongoing fire. Marked location for graves registration. Unrecoverable KIA. Killed in action whose body couldn't be immediately retrieved. But Cotton's body had been recovered, had been buried, had been sent home. So either Hoskins was mistaken about which body he'd marked, or something else had happened, something the official records didn't reflect. Chen dug deeper. He found after-action reports, casualty lists, burial records. Cotton Jones was listed as recovered on September 17th at 1830 hours, just before dark. But Hoskins' diary entry was time-stamped 1420 hours. That's a 4-hour gap. In those 4 hours, something happened that nobody documented officially. Chen interviewed 3 surviving members of Cotton's company, men now in their late 80s, their memories faded but still sharp about that day. All 3 remembered Cotton. 2 remembered he'd been carrying a diary. 1 remembered seeing him on the coral, pinned down, maybe 30 yards from shore. He was trying to get his gun working, the veteran said, his hands shaking as he spoke. The gun had jammed. He was exposed, trying to clear it. I saw him take a hit. I saw him go down. Then the smoke got thick, and I lost sight of him. But here's what made no sense. If Cotton had been hit at 1420 hours, roughly when Hoskins recovered the diary, how had he written in it? The last entry was dated September 17th. The handwriting was his. The blood was his. But the timeline was impossible. Unless he hadn't died instantly. Medical corpsmen in World War II operated under a brutal calculus. On beaches under fire, they had minutes to make decisions that determined who lived and who died. They carried morphine, bandages, plasma if they were lucky. They couldn't save everyone. They weren't supposed to try. The doctrine was clear. Treat those who could be saved and return to duty. Make comfortable those who couldn't. Move on. Don't linger. Don't think. Just move. Walter Hoskins had been 19 years old on Peleliu Beach, barely trained, terrified, doing a job that would give him nightmares for the next 67 years. In a letter he wrote to his sister in 1946, discovered among his effects, he described what it was like. You can't imagine what it means to decide someone is going to die. To look at a boy your own age, bleeding, calling for his mother, and know you can't help him. Know you have to leave him. Know you have to take your morphine and your bandages to someone else who has a chance. I still see their faces. All of them. Every single one. One of those faces, Chen believed, was Cotton Jones. The timeline suggested Cotton had been wounded around 1420 hours, probably in the initial moments after his Amtrak grounded on the coral. Hoskins found him sometime in the next 30 minutes, assessed him, made the decision that couldn't be unmade. Then took his personal effects, standard procedure for men who couldn't be immediately evacuated. The effects were supposed to be logged and sent to graves registration. But Hoskins kept the diary. Why? In another letter, written in 1952 to a veterans counselor, Hoskins came closest to explaining. There was a Marine on the coral, gut shot, maybe 20 years old. He was conscious when I got to him. That was the worst part, when they were conscious. He knew. I could see he knew. He had a diary in his pocket and he kept trying to show it to me. Kept saying a name, Laura something. Kept saying please. I took the diary. I told him I'd make sure she got it. I lied to a dying man to make him feel better. Then I left him there and moved on to the next one. I have carried that lie for 7 years. I don't know why I kept the diary. Maybe because keeping it was the only way to make the lie less of a lie. Maybe because giving it away would mean admitting what I'd done. But Cotton's body had been recovered. The official record stated it clearly, which meant either Hoskins was wrong about the Marine being unrecoverable, Or something else happened after Hoskins left. Chen found one more piece of evidence in the National Archives. A graves registration report, filed 3 days after the landing, that listed discrepancies in recovered remains. 23 bodies identified by dog tags, but showing signs of post-mortem relocation. The report used clinical language, but the meaning was clear. These bodies had been moved after death, presumably by other Marines who'd gone back for their brothers when the fire slackened. Cotton Jones was number 17 on that list. Someone had gone back for him, after Hoskins had pronounced him beyond help, after the diary had been taken. Someone had crawled back onto that coral outcrop, under fire or in darkness, and brought Cotton's body back. Who? The records didn't say. The survivors Chen interviewed couldn't remember. That was the nature of Peleliu, they explained. Everyone did things they couldn't remember later. Trauma erased details, left only impressions. Fire, blood, screaming. The specifics blurred together into one continuous nightmare. But the diary remembered. That final entry, written in handwriting that barely looked human, suggested something the official records would never acknowledge. Cotton Jones hadn't died instantly. He'd had time. Time to know he was dying. Time to write one last message. Time to hope, against all evidence, that somehow someone would make sure Laura Mae knew he was thinking of her at the end.
The story could have ended there. A tragic footnote to a brutal battle. A diary lost, then found, revealing nothing more than one young man's final moments. But in 2015, a researcher named Patricia Voss found something in the declassified intelligence files that changed the entire narrative. Peleliu wasn't supposed to happen. Not in September 1944, not the way it did, not with the casualties it produced. 3 weeks before the invasion, Naval Intelligence had delivered updated reconnaissance to SINCPAC headquarters. The new photographs, taken at low altitude by brave Navy pilots, showed something the earlier images had missed. The Japanese had transformed Peleliu into a fortress. Not the typical beach defenses the Americans had learned to overcome, but something new, something worse. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commanding the Japanese garrison, had studied every American amphibious assault since Guadalcanal. He'd learned that beach defenses failed, that banzai charges wasted men, that fighting the Americans on their terms was suicide. So he'd done something radical. He'd abandoned the beaches. Instead, he'd carved Peleliu's coral ridges into a honeycomb of caves and tunnels, 500 fortified positions connected underground, invisible from the air, impervious to naval bombardment. He'd positioned his artillery in caves with steel doors that opened only to fire, then closed before counter-battery fire could respond. He'd created a defense in depth that would force Americans to pay in blood for every yard. And Naval Intelligence had seen it. The photographs from August 28th showed the cave entrances, showed the camouflage positions, showed that the earlier assessment of a weakly defended island was catastrophically wrong. The report landed on Admiral Halsey's desk on September 2nd, 13 days before the invasion. Halsey read the report and immediately recommended canceling the operation. Peleliu, he argued, wasn't worth the casualties the new intelligence predicted. The airfield could be bypassed. The island could be isolated and left to wither. But the decision wasn't his alone. The Joint Chiefs had already committed resources. The plans were set. The political pressure to maintain momentum in the Pacific was intense. And there was another factor that the declassified documents revealed in clinical, bureaucratic language. The decision had already been made to test new amphibious assault doctrines at Peleliu. The island was seen not just as a tactical objective, but as a proving ground for tactics that would be used at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Marine Corps planners wanted to see how their new approaches to fortified positions would work under real combat conditions. They wanted data. They wanted lessons learned. They wanted, though they would never stated this baldly, acceptable casualties to justify future tactical modifications. So Peleliu went forward, with commanders knowing the intelligence was worse than what the troops were being told. with casualty estimates that were classified higher than the battle plans themselves, with what one internal memo called an acceptable level of attrition for the strategic value gained. Mack, the sergeant who Cotton said warned them, hadn't been drunk-talking. He'd been telling the truth. They knew. Not everyone. Not the men loading into M-tracks, not the junior officers leading platoons, but higher up, where decisions were made and resources allocated, they knew Peleliu was going to be a bloodbath. The official battle plan called for 4 days. The actual battle lasted 73 days. Casualties exceeded 40%. Exactly what Mack had said. The 1st Marine Division was so devastated it had to be withdrawn and didn't fight again for 6 months. And when it was over, when 1,794 Americans were dead and 8,010 wounded, the airfield that was supposed to be so strategically vital was barely used. A few emergency landings, some reconnaissance flights, nothing that justified the cost. Cotton Jones and 1,793 other men died for an island that didn't matter, in a battle that shouldn't have happened, with commanders who knew the intelligence briefings given to the troops were lies.
Patricia Voss wasn't looking for a conspiracy when she started her research. She was writing her doctoral dissertation on Pacific War logistics, dry academic work focused on supply chains and resource allocation. But while cross-referencing casualty reports with intelligence assessments, she noticed something odd, a pattern in what wasn't said. For most Pacific operations, intelligence briefings to combat units were documented extensively. Commanders kept records of what they told their men, when they told them, how threat assessments evolved. These records existed for Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, but for Peleliu, whole sections of the briefing documents were missing from the files, not redacted with the familiar black bars that indicated classified material, just missing. Pages that should have existed according to document numbering systems, but didn't. Voss filed Freedom of Information Act requests. She got back files with gaps. She requested specific documents referenced in other materials. They couldn't be located. She found mentions in officers' diaries of briefings that had no corresponding official record. It was as if someone had gone through the Peleliu files years after the battle and selectively removed anything that showed the discrepancy between what intelligence knew and what troops were told. Then she found the smoking gun. Not in military records, but in personal papers donated to the Marine Corps Historical Center by the widow of a colonel who'd served on the planning staff. Among letters and photographs was a memo dated September 8, 1944, 9 days before the invasion. The subject line read, Intelligence Dissemination Protocol for Operation Stalemate 2. Stalemate 2 was the code name for Peleliu. The memo was brief, bureaucratic, devastating. It outlined specific guidelines for what intelligence could be shared with units below regimental level. Updated casualty estimates, classified. Reconnaissance photographs showing cave fortifications, classified. Assessments suggesting operation duration beyond 4 days, classified. The reasoning given was operational security and maintenance of combat effectiveness through confidence management. Confidence management. That was the phrase they used. They managed the troops' confidence by withholding information that might have saved lives. The memo was signed by 3 officers. One was killed at Okinawa, one died in a car accident in 1947, the third lived until 1989, retiring as a major general, honored and decorated. In his oral history interview for the Naval Institute in 1986, he was asked about Peleliu. His answer was careful, rehearsed. The words of a man who'd spent 4 decades not saying something. Peleliu was a difficult operation that taught us valuable lessons about assaulting fortified positions, The casualties were regrettable, but not unexpected given the Japanese defensive strategy. Intelligence did the best they could with available information. Second-guessing decisions made under wartime pressure does a disservice to everyone who served. Not unexpected. That phrase stuck with Voss, because in every other interview, in every other document, officers described Peleliu casualties as shocking, devastating, far worse than anticipated. But this man who'd signed the memo controlling what troops were told said they were not unexpected. He'd expected them, because he'd seen the real intelligence. Voss tried to interview him. He was dead. She tried to interview his staff. Most were dead. The two she found alive refused to talk about Peleliu specifically. One hung up when she mentioned the September 8th memo. The other sent a letter through his lawyer stating he had nothing to add to his official service record. The silence was its own answer. Cotton Jones had written that Mac told them the smart boys no. He was right. They knew. They sent 28,000 Marines into a battle they knew would be far worse than they'd been told, because the alternative was admitting the operation should be canceled, which would mean admitting the planning had been flawed, which would mean questioning the entire island-hopping strategy, which would mean political and military consequences no one wanted to face. So they managed confidence. They told the troops it would be 4 days. They withheld the photographs. They kept the casualty estimates classified. And when it was over, when the bodies were counted and the statistics compiled, they made sure the paper trail didn't show what they knew and when they knew it.
When historians talk about Peleliu, they use statistics: 1,794 American dead, 8,010 wounded, 10,695 Japanese killed. These numbers appear in books, documentaries, museum displays. Clean, final. But behind every number was a name, a face, a person who woke up on September 15th, 1944, not knowing it was their last morning. Cotton Jones was number 1,252 in the casualty count. He died on day 3 of an operation planned for 4 days. His death contributed to the 40% casualty rate that Mac had warned about, that intelligence had predicted, that commanders had classified. He became a data point in the lessons learned documents that justified changing amphibious assault doctrine for future operations. His death had strategic value, just not to him. Laura Mae read through the diary over the course of 3 days at the museum. She refused to let them make copies until she'd read every word herself, touched every page, traced the letters he'd written. The conservators stood nearby, anxious about the fragile paper, but she needed this. 70 years of not knowing, and now she knew too much. She read about his fear, his doubts, his love for her that he'd carried across an ocean into hell. She read the entry about Mac's warning, about how they knew something was wrong. And she read that final, impossible entry, written in handwriting that looked like it came from someone else entirely. Someone who was bleeding out on volcanic coral while the world exploded around him. When she finished, she sat in silence for 20 minutes. The museum staff didn't interrupt. What could they say? Finally, she spoke, and a camera recording oral histories captured her words. He knew, they all knew something wasn't right. And nobody listened, nobody stopped it. They sent my Cotton and all those other boys into that knowing. And for what? An airfield they barely used? A test? I've spent 70 years thinking he died for something important. Something that mattered. But he didn't, did he? He died because someone decided his life was an acceptable cost for data. The museum director started to offer the standard reassurances. All military deaths have meaning. They died for freedom. Their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Laura Mae cut him off. Don't you dare try to make this noble. Cotton was 22. He wanted to fix cars and have babies and grow old. That's what they took from him. That's what they took from all of us who loved him. And they knew. That's what I can't forgive. They knew it would be worse than they said, and they sent them anyway. She was right. And the tragedy was that Peleliu wasn't unique. Throughout the Pacific War, throughout all wars, commanders made calculations balancing objectives against casualties. Sometimes those calculations were necessary. Sometimes they saved more lives than they cost. But sometimes they were just bureaucratic momentum, political pressure, the inability to admit a mistake before men died for it. Peleliu was supposed to secure an airfield for the invasion of the Philippines, but by the time the battle ended in November, MacArthur had already landed in the Philippines. The airfield was strategically obsolete before the island was secured. The 73-day battle that was supposed to last 4 days had accomplished nothing that couldn't have been achieved by bypassing the island entirely, exactly as Halsey had recommended. Cotton Jones died for a bureaucratic decision that someone was afraid to reverse.
One name kept appearing in documents related to Cotton's recovery: Private First Class Joseph Martinez, listed as KIA on September 17th, same day as Cotton, same company, same wave. But unlike Cotton, Martinez's body wasn't recovered until September 19th, and when it was found, he wasn't where he should have been. He was 40 yards from where he'd been reported down, moved post-mortem, found next to another body that Graves' registration initially couldn't identify due to damage. That unidentified body was later confirmed as Cotton Jones through dental records. Chen tracked down Martinez's nephew, a man in his 60s who'd grown up hearing stories about his Uncle Joe. The family had received a letter in 1945 from one of Martinez's squad mates, a man named Eddie Riley who'd survived the war. The letter was brief, the kind of thing survivors wrote to give families closure, describing Martinez as brave, well-liked, died instantly, didn't suffer. Standard comfort lies. But there was one line that never made sense to the family. Joe went back for his buddy when he didn't have to. That's the kind of man he was. Went back. What did that mean? Martinez had been killed in the initial landing. How could he have gone back? The nephew had always assumed it was poorly worded, that Riley meant Martinez had stayed to help someone instead of taking cover. But now, looking at the timeline of when bodies were recovered, the nephew wondered if there was more to it. Chen found Eddie Riley's name in a nursing home database. He was 94, living in Florida, his memory fading, but still sharp about some things, about that day especially. When Chen called and mentioned Peleliu, there was a long silence. Then, Riley asked a question that made Chen's hands shake. "Did you find the diary?" Riley knew about it. He'd been there. He agreed to an interview, recorded audio that Chen later donated to the National Archives. What Riley described was a scene that appeared in no official record, a moment of humanity in mechanical hell that explained why 2 bodies were found together 2 days after they'd been reported killed. The third wave hit the coral at 0915. Cotton's Amtrak grounded short, forcing the men to wade through chest-deep water under fire. Cotton, carrying the machine gun, was slower than the others. He made it to the coral shelf 30 yards from shore and went down, hit in the abdomen. Martinez, who'd been right behind him, saw him fall. "We were supposed to keep moving," Riley said, his voice weak but clear. "That was the doctrine. Don't stop for wounded. The corpsmen will get them. Keep the momentum, keep moving or you die." Joe knew that. We all knew that. But Cotton was his buddy. They'd gone through training together. Joe stopped. Riley and 2 others kept moving, found cover behind a destroyed Amtrak, pinned down by machine gun fire from the ridge. They stayed there for 3 hours, watching men die, watching the beach turn red, watching the carefully planned assault dissolve into chaos. Around 1400 hours, the fire slackened for a moment. The Japanese were repositioning, reloading, dealing with their own casualties. "Joe wasn't with us anymore," Riley continued. "I'd lost track of him in the fire. I figured he was dead. Then, I saw him. He was crawling back onto the coral where Cotton went down. I yelled at him, called him every name I knew. The fire was starting up again. He was going to get himself killed for a guy who was probably already dead. But Joe didn't stop. He crawled out there, and I watched him reach Cotton, and I watched Cotton move. Cotton was alive. 4 hours after he'd been hit, left for dead by a corpsman who'd done triage and moved on. Cotton Jones was alive on that coral. Conscious enough to know Martinez was there, conscious enough to push something at him. The diary. Joe took it. I saw him put it in his jacket. Then he tried to drag Cotton back, but he couldn't. Cotton was too heavy, and Joe was too exhausted, and the fire came back. I saw Joe get hit. I saw him go down on top of Cotton. I saw them both stop moving. I didn't see anyone alive out there after that. But Martinez hadn't died immediately either. The autopsy report, which Chen found after weeks of searching, showed Martinez had been hit twice, once in the leg, severing his femoral artery, once in the chest, puncturing his lung. The chest wound was the fatal one, but it would have taken minutes, not seconds. Minutes of drowning in his own blood, lying on top of his friend, both of them dying together on volcanic coral while the battle raged around them. "I've thought about those two every day for 70 years, Riley said. And now he was crying, this 94-year-old man weeping for friends who died when he was 19. Joe went back. He didn't have to. He could have stayed in cover with us, but he went back and he died for it. And I never told anyone because what was the point? They were both dead. The diary was gone. What good would it do to tell their families they died slow instead of fast, that Joe threw his life away for a lost cause? But Joe hadn't thrown his life away because somehow, impossibly, that diary survived. Someone else found them, found the diary in Martinez's jacket, took it, kept it, and eventually it made its way to Walter Hoskins, who kept it for 67 years before dying with it among his possessions.
The mystery of how the diary traveled from Martinez's jacket to Hoskins' estate became an obsession for a Marine veteran named Thomas Bridges. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq and came home with questions about how the Corps handled casualties, how personal effects were processed, how the system worked or failed. When he heard about Cotton's diary, he saw it as a case study in everything that could go wrong. Bridges filed FOIA requests for graves registration records from Peleliu. What he got back were documents so heavily redacted they were almost useless. But in the margins, in the unredacted portions, he found names. Corpsmen assigned to the beach, graves registration personnel, Marines detailed to body recovery after the initial assault. He started tracking them down, or their families if they'd died. One name appeared multiple times. Corporal Richard Chen, no relation to Dr. Robert Chen. Richard Chen had been a graves registration specialist, one of the men tasked with the grim work of identifying, documenting, and processing the dead. His service record showed he'd been at Peleliu from D-Day through October, handling hundreds of bodies,
maintaining the paperwork that turned dead Marines into filed reports. Richard Chen had died in 1998, but his daughter still lived in California. When Bridges contacted her, she was reluctant to talk. Her father had never discussed the war. He'd kept his service records in a locked box that she'd never opened until after his death. But when Bridges mentioned the diary, she went quiet. "Wait," she said. "The diary that was in the news. The one they gave to that old woman." She knew about it. Her father had known about it. In that locked box, among medals and citations and photographs, was a letter her father had written but never sent. It was addressed to Corporal W. Hoskins, USS Pinckney, dated October 15, 1944. The letter was short, clinical, wrong in ways that suggested enormous guilt compressed into formal language. "Dear Corporal Hoskins, I'm writing to inform you that your documentation regarding casualties on September 17th contained discrepancies that have been resolved through subsequent recovery operations. The Marine identified in your initial report as unrecoverable was in fact recovered on September 19th through the efforts of Graves registration personnel. His personal effects, which you collected in good faith, should have been returned to the chain of custody at that time. I understand the chaos of combat makes such protocols difficult to maintain. This letter serves as official notice that the effects in question, specifically one diary, should be returned to proper channels for processing and notification of next of kin. Please contact the Graves Registration Office at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer." The letter was never sent. It was never stamped, never addressed, never mailed. Richard Chen had written it, then kept it with his service records for 58 years until his death. His daughter had no idea why. But Bridges understood. Chen had discovered the discrepancy, had realized Hoskins had kept personal effects that should have been returned, had written the letter to fix it, then had made a decision that haunted him enough to keep evidence of it locked away for 5 decades. He'd let Hoskins keep the diary. Why? The daughter found another document that suggested an answer. A personal journal Chen had kept separate from official records. The entry for October 14, 1944, explained his reasoning in words that were achingly human. "Found the paperwork error today. Corpsman took effects from a Marine he thought wouldn't be recovered. We recovered the body 2 days later. Proper procedure is to retrieve the effects and process them. I wrote the letter. Then I looked at the effects list. Dog tags, processed. Photograph, processed. Letters, processed. Diary, retained by Corpsman. I should demand it back. It's Marine property. It belongs to next of kin. But I keep thinking about why a Corpsman would keep it. Maybe he promised the Marine something. Maybe the Marine was conscious when he took it. Maybe the Marine asked him to deliver it personally. Maybe the Corpsman is carrying that promise like we all carry our own burdens from this island. If I demand the diary back, it goes into the system. It gets shipped to some warehouse with 10,000 other items. It sits for months, maybe years, until someone processes it and mails it to next of kin. Or it gets lost. The system loses things. I've seen it happen. But if the Corpsman kept it, maybe he means to fulfill whatever promise he made. Maybe he'll do better by this dead Marine than regulations would." Chen was wrong. Hoskins never delivered the diary, never contacted Laura Mae, never fulfilled whatever promise he might have made. He kept it for 67 years, this physical manifestation of guilt, until he died alone and it was sold to settle debts. But Chen had made his decision based on hope, based on the belief that human conscience might accomplish what bureaucracy couldn't.
Patricia Voss published her findings in 2016. The academic paper was dry, technical, filled with footnotes and careful language that avoided direct accusations. But the conclusion was damning. The intelligence failure at Peleliu wasn't a failure at all. It was a decision to prioritize operational momentum over accurate threat assessment, made at command levels that insulated decision-makers from the consequences of their choices. The paper got little attention outside military history circles. One academic journal published it. A few historians cited it. The general public never heard about it because 70-year-old bureaucratic decisions don't make headlines. But within the Marine Corps, it caused quiet discomfort. Not because anyone denied the facts, but because acknowledging them meant acknowledging something that questioned the entire command structure. The Marine Corps' official response was carefully neutral. The operation at Peleliu was conducted according to the strategic and tactical understanding of the time. All decisions were made with the information available and the pressures of ongoing Pacific operations. Second-guessing wartime decisions with peacetime hindsight serves no constructive purpose. But some veterans disagreed. A group of Peleliu survivors, now in their 90s, wrote an open letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps. They didn't demand apologies or acknowledgement. They asked for something simpler and somehow more profound. They wanted the truth added to the official history. They wanted the record to show that intelligence knew the battle would be worse than troops were told. They wanted Cotton Jones and the 1,793 others who died to be remembered not just as casualties of war, but as casualties of specific decisions made by specific people. The request was denied. The official history of Peleliu remained unchanged. The lessons learned documents stayed classified. The memos about intelligence dissemination protocols remained in archives that required specific clearances to access. The system protected itself the way systems always do, by maintaining the narrative that served institutional interests rather than historical accuracy. But the diary existed. Laura Mae made sure of that. She donated it to the National World War II Museum with one condition. It had to be displayed publicly, with the full context of what Cotton wrote, what he knew, what happened to him. The museum agreed. Now, in a climate-controlled case in New Orleans, visitors can see the diary. They can read Cotton's words about Mac's warning. They can see the impossible final entry. They can draw their own conclusions about what it means. Some visitors see it as a tragic story of war's chaos, where miscommunication and fog of battle led to unfortunate outcomes. Others see it as evidence of systemic problems with how military institutions prioritize objectives over lives. Both interpretations exist side by side, and the museum doesn't choose between them. They present the diary, the documents, the timeline, and let people decide. But there's one detail the museum added after Voss published her research. Next to the diary is a small placard with a quote from that September 8th memo about confidence management through intelligence dissemination protocols. No context, no explanation, just the words themselves, letting visitors make the connection between what commanders knew and what Cotton wrote about Mac's warning.
The museum exhibit includes more than just Cotton's diary. After Laura Mae's donation, other families came forward with materials related to Peleliu: photographs, letters, journals kept by men who survived. Together, they paint a picture of what that September morning looked like, beyond the statistics and tactical maps. One photograph shows Cotton's unit before they boarded the transports. 42 men arranged in rows, all wearing the same expression of forced confidence. The photo is dated September 14th, taken on the deck of the USS Sea Runner. Someone had written names on the back in pencil, identifying each face. 26 of those names have small crosses next to them, added later by a survivor,
marking who didn't make it. Cotton is in the second row, third from the left. He's not smiling, but he's not grim either, just present, existing in that moment, unaware he has less than 24 hours of life remaining. Next to him is Martinez, the man who would crawl back to save him and die trying. 2 men over is Eddie Riley, who would watch it happen and carry the guilt for 7 decades. The museum created an interactive display where visitors can tap on each face and see what happened to them. Some survived the war, some died at Peleliu, some died later, at Okinawa, or in accidents or from wounds that took months to kill them. Each name links to what records exist: service files, casualty reports, sometimes letters home, sometimes nothing but a date and a cause of death reduced to military shorthand. But there's another photograph that Chen discovered in archives that tells a different story. It's an aerial reconnaissance image taken on August 28, 1944. The one that showed the Japanese cave fortifications. The one that naval intelligence delivered to command 3 weeks before the invasion. The image is high resolution enough to see the cave entrances, the camouflaged positions, the evidence that Peleliu was nothing like intelligence had initially assessed. The museum displays this photograph next to the earlier reconnaissance image from June, the one that showed beaches and an airfield and not much else. The difference is obvious even to untrained eyes. The August image reveals a fortress. And someone had known. Someone had seen this photograph, had understood what it meant, and had made the decision to proceed anyway, with briefings that told troops to expect 4 days of light resistance. A Marine Corps veteran named James Morrison visited the exhibit in 2017. He'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, had seen what happened when intelligence failures or deliberate misrepresentations got people killed. He stood in front of those 2 photographs for 30 minutes, long enough that museum security checked on him twice. Finally, he left a comment in the visitor book that the museum later published with permission. I've been to the briefings where they tell you it'll be easy. I've walked into places that weren't easy. Sometimes that's war. Sometimes intelligence is wrong. Sometimes the enemy surprises you. But this is different. They knew. The proof is right there on that wall. They knew it would be worse, and they sent them anyway. We trust that the people giving orders are operating in good faith, that they're not lying to us, that if they're sending us into hell, they're at least being honest about the fire. Cotton Jones trusted that. All those guys in that photograph trusted that. And that trust got them killed. That's the real casualty of Peleliu, not just the 1,794 dead, but the trust that dies when you realize the institution you serve will sacrifice you for reasons it won't even admit. The comment sparked debate. Other veterans defended the decision-makers, argued that wartime command involves impossible choices, that second-guessing with hindsight was unfair. Some historians pointed out that every military operation involves acceptable risk calculations, that commanders can't guarantee 0 casualties, that perfect intelligence doesn't exist. But Morrison's point wasn't about acceptable risk. It was about honesty, about the difference between this will be dangerous and this will be easy when you know it will be catastrophic. About the social contract that makes military service possible, the assumption that leaders won't deliberately deceive those whose lives depend on accurate information.
Laura Mae Davis Burlingame died on March 3, 2016, at age 93. She'd lived 3 years after receiving Cotton's diary, 3 years of finally knowing what his last thoughts had been, 3 years of understanding that the boy she'd loved had died thinking of her. But also 3 years of knowing he died in a battle that commanders knew would be worse than they'd told him. Her obituary in the Mooresville newspaper was brief.
It mentioned her children, her grandchildren, her work as a teacher for 30 years. It mentioned her first love killed at Peleliu and how his diary had been returned to her after 7 decades. It didn't mention the anger she carried those last 3 years, the sense of betrayal on behalf of a boy who couldn't speak for himself anymore. But her daughter spoke at the funeral, and what she said was recorded by the local historian. Mom spent 70 years wondering if Cotton's last thoughts were of her. When she got the diary, she found out they were. That should have given her peace. But it didn't. Not completely. Because she also found out he died knowing something was wrong, knowing they'd been lied to, and there was nothing he could do about it. She said it was like losing him twice, once in 1944 when he died, and once in 2013 when she learned why. The museum kept Cotton's diary on display, but they added something after Laura Mae's death. A photograph of her, taken in 2013, holding the diary for the first time in 70 years. Her face in that photograph tells the whole story. Joy and grief and anger, all mixed together in the expression of a woman who finally has answers, but wishes she didn't. Next to her photograph is one of Cotton, the same image he'd carried into battle, the one that had survived in his helmet. They're young in both photos, separated by 70 years, but frozen at the same moment in different ways. Cotton, forever 22. Laura Mae finally understanding what that moment cost. The museum now uses their story in educational programs about the human cost of war. Not the abstract discussions of strategy and tactics, but the specific reality of individual lives ended or damaged by decisions made in offices far from battlefields. School groups tour the exhibit, veterans visit. Families of other wars, other battles, other losses stand in front of that display case and see their own stories reflected. Because Peleliu wasn't unique. The specific details were, but the pattern wasn't. Throughout history, people have died in battles that shouldn't have happened for objectives that didn't matter because someone made a calculation that their lives were an acceptable cost for something else. Cotton Jones and 1,793 others died at Peleliu. But how many others died in how many other battles where commanders knew more than they told? The exhibit doesn't answer that question. It can't. But it makes visitors ask it. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the real purpose of preserving Cotton's diary, of displaying those reconnaissance photographs side by side, of telling Laura Mae's story, isn't to assign blame for something that happened 80 years ago. Maybe it's to make people think about what honesty costs and what dishonesty costs, and which one we can actually live with.
Eddie Riley died 6 months after giving his interview to Dr. Chen. The recording became his final testimony, the unburdening of a secret he'd carried since he was 19 years old. His family said he seemed lighter after the interview, as if speaking the truth about Martinez and Cotton had lifted something that decades of silence had made heavier. But Riley wasn't the only survivor carrying weight. In 2018, the museum launched an oral history project specifically focused on Peleliu. They found 47 men still alive who'd been there, men now in their mid-90s running out of time to tell their stories. What emerged from those interviews was a pattern of knowledge and silence that extended far beyond Cotton Jones' diary. They'd known. Not all of them, not the privates loading into Amtraks, but the NCOs, the staff sergeants and gunnery sergeants who'd been through previous campaigns, they'd known something was wrong with the briefings. They'd seen the disconnect between what intelligence said and what their experience told them, and they'd made a choice, each of them individually, to either warn their men or maintain operational confidence. Gunnery Sergeant Walter Pierce had been a squad leader in Cotton's battalion. He survived Peleliu, survived the rest of the war, lived to age 96. In his interview, recorded 3 months before he died,
He described the impossible position NCOs found themselves in. "You know it's worse than they're saying. You've been in enough fights to recognize when headquarters is selling sunshine. But what do you do? Tell your men the brass is lying? Destroy their confidence before they even hit the beach? Or keep your mouth shut and hope somehow you're wrong? Hope the intelligence is right this time, even though you know it isn't?" I chose silence. I told my boys what I was supposed to tell them. 4 days, light resistance, will be off the island in a week. And I watched them believe me because they trusted me. Then I watched them die because I didn't warn them. This wasn't unique to Peleliu. This was the machinery of every military operation, the necessity of maintaining morale even when truth might serve better. But at Peleliu, the gap between what commanders knew and what troops were told was so large that it broke something in the men who survived. They came home carrying not just the standard trauma of combat, but the specific burden of knowing they'd been deceived, that their friends had died for reasons that didn't match what they'd been told. The suicide rate among Peleliu survivors was notably higher than other Pacific campaigns. The VA noticed, but never investigated why. The pattern was there in the statistics. Men who survived the battle but couldn't survive the peace, who drank themselves to death or put guns in their mouths, or simply faded away from depression that medications couldn't touch. The official cause was always listed as combat trauma, PTSD, the general psychological cost of war. But some families knew there was more to it. Robert Johnson's father had been at Peleliu. He'd survived physically intact, came home, got married, had kids, worked construction for 40 years. But he never talked about the war, never joined veteran organizations, never attended reunions. And in 1987, at age 63, he killed himself in his garage with carbon monoxide. No note, no explanation, just gone. 20 years later, Johnson found his father's war diary while cleaning out his mother's house after her death. The entries from Peleliu were sparse, factual, emotionless. But there was one passage dated November 1944, 2 months after the battle, written while he was recovering at a base hospital. "We knew it was wrong. The briefings didn't match what we'd seen before. The sergeants knew. Some of them tried to tell us in ways that wouldn't get them court-martialed. But we wanted to believe. We wanted to believe it would be easy because the alternative was too terrible to think about. So we let ourselves be lied to. We participated in our own deception. And when it went bad, when it was everything the sergeants had warned us about and worse, we couldn't even be angry because we'd chosen to believe the lie. That's what I can't forgive. Not the commanders who lied, not the intelligence that was wrong, but myself for wanting it so badly for it to be easy that I ignored every sign it wouldn't be." This was the hidden cost of Peleliu. Not just the dead, but the living, who carried the knowledge that they'd survived something that might have been prevented if someone had made different choices. If Halsey's recommendation to cancel had been accepted. If the intelligence showing the cave fortifications had been shared with the troops. If someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had been willing to admit the operation should be reconsidered.
The Marine Corps has a saying, "Once a Marine, always a Marine." It speaks to identity, to belonging, to a bond forged in shared experience. But at Peleliu, that bond was tested by something the institution didn't acknowledge, the betrayal inherent in being sent into battle with information commanders knew was incomplete or wrong. General Raymond Murray, who commanded a battalion at Peleliu and later became a 3-star general, addressed this obliquely in his 1992 memoir. He never used words like deception or cover-up, but his meaning was clear to anyone who understood the context. In war, commanders must balance competing priorities. Perfect information is impossible. Perfect outcomes are fantasy.
We make decisions with incomplete knowledge, under impossible pressure, and men die because of those decisions. That is the burden of command. What haunts me about Peleliu is not that men died, death is inevitable in war, but that some died because we prioritized strategic considerations over tactical honesty. We knew more than we told them. We had reasons, good reasons, in the context of maintaining operational momentum and morale. But those reasons don't make the dead any less dead, or the deception any more justified. This was as close as anyone at Murray's level ever came to acknowledging what Voss's research had proven. But even this measured admission came 48 years after the battle, in a memoir published when most decision-makers were dead and institutional consequences were minimal. The active-duty Marine Corps never made such acknowledgments. The official histories remained sanitized, clinical, focused on tactics and outcomes rather than decision-making processes and information flow. But within the institution, Peleliu became a case study taught at command schools, not in the official curriculum, but in the informal education that happens in bars and officer clubs where senior Marines mentor junior ones. The lesson wasn't written down, but it was transmitted. Don't lie to your men about what they're walking into. They'll trust you once. If you break that trust, you'll never get it back, and neither will the institution. Colonel Marcus Wright, teaching at the Marine Corps War College in 2015, included Cotton's diary in a presentation about intelligence dissemination and command responsibility. He didn't have official approval. He just showed the photographs of the reconnaissance images, read excerpts from Cotton's entries about Mac's warning, and asked his students a question. You're a battalion commander. Intelligence delivers updated reconnaissance showing the operation will be significantly worse than initial assessments. You're told to maintain the briefing to preserve morale and operational security. Your Marines trust you. What do you do? The answers split roughly in thirds. 1/3 said they'd follow orders and maintain the briefing, trusting that higher command had reasons for their decision. 1/3 said they'd find a way to warn their men without explicitly contradicting the official line, using the same coded language Mac had used. 1/3 said they'd refuse the order and demand the intelligence be shared, accepting whatever career consequences followed. Wright's response to all three groups was the same. Whichever choice you make, men might die because of it. But only one choice lets you look at yourself in the mirror afterward. Only one choice preserves the trust that makes this institution function. And only one choice means that if those men die, they at least die knowing the truth. Wright was forced to retire 6 months later. The official reason was budget cuts and force reduction. The unofficial reason, whispered in officer circles, was that his presentation had made too many senior officers uncomfortable. That talking about Peleliu in those terms raised questions about other operations, other decisions, other times when troops were told one thing while commanders knew another. The institution protected itself, as institutions always do, by making the conversation difficult to have. But it couldn't erase Cotton's diary. It couldn't unmake the photograph showing reconnaissance that proved commanders knew. It couldn't silence the survivors who decided in their final years that truth mattered more than institutional comfort.
Laura Mae had taught elementary school for 30 years. 3rd grade, the age where children still believe adults have all the answers, where authority figures are assumed to be honest because why would they lie? She'd spent her career trying to be worthy of that trust, and then she'd learned that the institution Cotton had trusted had deliberately withheld information that might have saved his life. Her daughter found letters Laura Mae had written but never sent, drafted in the months after receiving the diary. One was addressed to the Secretary of Defense, one to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, one to the President, all saying essentially the same thing. Acknowledge what happened, add it to the official record, let the families know their sons and husbands and fathers died because someone made a choice that valued strategy over honesty. None of the letters were mailed. Her daughter asked why in those final months before Laura Mae died. The answer was simple and heartbreaking. Because Cotton's not here to speak for himself, and I can't speak for him without wondering if I'm putting my anger in his mouth. Maybe he would have understood. Maybe he would have said the commanders did what they had to do. Maybe he would have forgiven them. I can't know, so I can't pretend to speak for him. All I can do is make sure people know what he wrote, what he knew, what he experienced, and let them decide what it means. But there was another letter Laura Mae did send, to a high school in Indiana offering to speak to history classes about the diary and what it revealed. She gave 3 talks before her health declined. A teacher at one of those talks recorded her final presentation. The video's grainy, the audio poor, but her words are clear. I want you to understand something about war that the movies don't show you. It's not just about the people who die. It's about everyone connected to them who lives with the absence. Cotton and I talked about having 2 kids, maybe 3. Those children don't exist. They were never born because he died on a beach in 1944. And their children don't exist, and their children's children. There's a whole family tree that was cut down before it could grow, and I'm the only one who knows what it might have looked like. She paused, and in the video you can see her struggling with emotion, this 92-year-old woman trying to explain something that went beyond words. When I got the diary, I learned he died thinking of me, thinking of that future we'd planned. And I learned he died knowing something wasn't right, knowing they'd been lied to. So now I carry both of those things, the knowledge that he loved me to the end, and the knowledge that the end didn't have to happen when it did, the way it did. And I don't know which one weighs more. A student asked her if she was angry at the military. Her answer became the most quoted part of that talk. I'm angry at the decision, not the institution. I'm angry at the calculation that said lying to young men about what they were walking into was acceptable if it preserved morale. I'm angry that nobody ever admitted it, that the families were never told, that the history books still say Peleliu was just a hard battle when it was a battle that commanders knew would be worse than they told the troops. But I'm not angry at Cotton's buddies, or the sergeants who tried to warn them, or even most of the officers who were following orders they didn't make. I'm angry at the system that made that kind of deception possible, and then protected itself by never acknowledging it happened. That distinction mattered to her. She didn't want Cotton's story used to attack veterans or to diminish military service. She wanted it to stand as evidence that institutions, even necessary ones, even ones built on honor and sacrifice, can make choices that betray the people they're supposed to protect, and that acknowledging those choices, learning from them, is the only way to prevent them from happening again.
In 2019, a Marine officer named Captain Sarah Chen, granddaughter of Richard Chen, the Graves registration specialist, requested access to her grandfather's service records. She'd grown up knowing he'd been at Peleliu, knowing he'd carried something heavy from the war, but never knowing what. After his daughter showed her the unsent letter about Cotton's diary, Sarah wanted to understand the full context of the decision her grandfather had made. What she found in the archives was a pattern. Richard Chen hadn't just made one decision to let Hoskins keep the diary, he'd made dozens of similar decisions throughout his time at Peleliu. Small acts of discretion, where he'd chosen humanity over regulation, where he'd let things slide that technically violated protocols, where he'd prioritized what seemed right over what was required. A corpsman who'd kept a wounded Marine's wedding ring to personally deliver to the widow instead of shipping it through official channels. A sergeant who'd taken letters from a dead friend to make sure they were actually mailed instead of lost in the system. A chaplain who'd kept personal Bibles that should have been inventoried and returned through proper procedures, but instead were given directly to grieving families. Richard Chen had documented all of it, not in official reports, but in his personal journal. Each entry noting the violation, explaining his reasoning, accepting responsibility if it ever came back on him. He'd created his own parallel record of all the times he'd chosen compassion over compliance, all the small rebellions against a system he believed was failing the dead and their families. The journal's final entry, dated November 30th, 1944, as he was leaving Peleliu, summarized his philosophy in words that his granddaughter would later have inscribed on his headstone. "I have broken regulations 47 times in 76 days. I have allowed personal effects to leave proper custody. I have permitted unauthorized personnel to handle remains. I have failed to enforce documentation protocols. I have done all of this knowingly, deliberately, accepting that if discovered, I will face consequences. But I have also ensured that 47 families received something beyond a form letter and a flag, something personal, something that says their loved one mattered as an individual, not just as a casualty number. If that costs me my career, so be it. I can live with a court-martial. I cannot live with being complicit in a system that treats the dead as paperwork." He was never court-martialed. The violations were never discovered, or if they were, someone chose to look the other way. Richard Chen came home, lived a quiet life, and died having never told anyone about his small rebellion against regulations that valued procedure over people. But his granddaughter understood. She was facing her own version of the same question. The modern Marine Corps had changed, had learned some lessons from Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. But institutions are slow to change, and the fundamental tension between operational necessity and individual humanity remained. She'd seen it in Afghanistan, seen intelligence reports that didn't match the briefings, seen soldiers sent on missions with information that wasn't quite complete. She'd made her own choices about what to tell her platoon and what to hold back, and like her grandfather, she'd documented those choices in a private journal, creating her own record of the times when she'd prioritized her Marines' trust over strict adherence to what higher command wanted communicated. "I understand now why he kept that letter," she wrote in her own journal after reading her grandfather's. He was creating evidence of his own complicity in case the system ever wanted to hold someone accountable. He was saying, "Here's what I did. Here's why I did it. If you want to punish someone, punish me." But he was also creating a record for himself, proof that he'd tried to be human in an inhuman situation. That's what we all do, those of us who serve. We document our small rebellions against the machinery that would turn people into numbers. We keep our private records of the times we chose right over regulation. And we hope that someday someone will understand why we made those choices. The pattern extended beyond the Chen family. Across the country, families of Peleliu veterans were discovering similar private records, journals, letters, personal notes that showed a widespread awareness among those who'd been there that something about the operation had been fundamentally wrong. Not the execution, not the valor of the men who fought, but the decision-making that had sent them into a battle commanders knew would be worse than the troops were told. These private records never became official history. They remained scattered, personal, uncoordinated. But together they formed a shadow archive, a counter-narrative to the sanitized official version, preserved by people who believed that truth mattered, even when institutions found it inconvenient.
Cotton Jones's diary sits in its climate-controlled case in New Orleans, a small leather book that somehow survived 70 years of loss and silence. Over 200,000 people have viewed it since it went on display. They come from everywhere, veterans and civilians, young and old, American and foreign. They stand in front of that case and read his words and see the photographs and draw their own conclusions. Some see a tragic story of war's inevitable chaos. Some see evidence of institutional failure. Some see both. The museum doesn't tell them what to think. It just presents the evidence. The diary, the reconnaissance photographs, the timeline, the documents, the oral histories. Here's what happened. Here's what was known, and when it was known. Here's what Cotton wrote. Here's what Laura Mae experienced. Decide for yourself what it means. But the diary's impact extends beyond the museum. It's been cited in military ethics courses, in discussions about command responsibility, in debates about transparency and trust within hierarchical organizations. It's become a touchstone for conversations about the social contract between those who give orders and those who follow them. Military academies use Cotton's story as a case study, not to shame the institution, but to illustrate the long-term cost of short-term deceptions. Trust once broken takes generations to rebuild. Men who feel they were lied to don't just lose faith in specific commanders, they lose faith in the institution itself. And that loss of faith ripples outward, affecting recruitment, retention, morale, effectiveness. The Marine Corps has never officially acknowledged that troops at Peleliu were given intelligence briefings that commanders knew were incomplete. But in 2020, the Commandant issued new guidance on information dissemination in combat operations. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was clear. Commanders have a responsibility to share threat assessments as accurately as possible, even when that information might be demoralizing. The guidance cited no specific historical examples, but everyone who'd followed the debate about Cotton's diary understood the subtext. This was as close as the institution could come to admitting that Peleliu had taught a lesson about honesty, even if that lesson took 76 years to formalize into policy. Laura Mae didn't live to see that guidance issued, but her daughter did, and she understood it for what it was. Not an apology. Institutions don't apologize for decisions made by people long dead, but an acknowledgement that the pattern of deception Cotton had documented couldn't be allowed to continue. That the trust between Marines and their commanders was too valuable to risk on information management and confidence maintenance. Cotton's diary achieved what Laura Mae had hoped for in those unsent letters. Not vindication, not punishment, not even formal acknowledgement, but change. Incremental, bureaucratic, easy to miss if you weren't looking, but real. Today, in a small cemetery in Indiana, Cotton Jones is buried under a headstone that lists his name, his dates, and the words, Corporal, USMC, Peleliu. Next to his grave is a newer stone, placed there in 2016. It bears Laura Mae's name, her dates, and a single line. Finally together, finally home. She'd asked to be buried next to him, this man she'd loved for 2 years and mourned for 70. Her family honored that request. Now they rest side by side, the boy who never came home and the woman who waited a lifetime for answers. Visitors sometimes leave items at Cotton's grave: flowers, flags, small stones in the Jewish tradition of remembrance. But most often they leave letters, written notes saying, "Thank you for your service," or "I'm sorry for what happened," or "Your story matters." The cemetery doesn't remove them. They accumulate against the headstone, a physical manifestation of how one Marine's diary has touched thousands of people who never knew him. Because that's what Cotton's story ultimately represents. Not just one young man's death on a Pacific beach, but the universal question of what we owe each other in systems built on trust. What commanders owe troops, what institutions owe individuals,
what those in power owe to those who have given them authority. Cotton trusted that if he was being sent into battle, he was being told the truth about what he faced. That trust was betrayed, and the consequences of that betrayal rippled forward for 70 decades, touching lives that would never know his name, but would be affected by the lessons learned from his death. The diary remains on display, will remain there for as long as the museum exists. A small leather book, damaged and worn, containing words written by a 22-year-old who just wanted to come home and fix cars and have a family. Words that documented not just his death, but the death of trust between institutions and the people they're supposed to serve. Young Marines visit that exhibit now. They read Cotton's words about Mac's warning, about knowing something was wrong, but being powerless to stop it. They see the reconnaissance photographs that proved commanders knew the intelligence briefings were incomplete, and they ask themselves the question every service member must eventually confront. If ordered into a situation where they suspect they're not being told the full truth, what will they do? There's no right answer to that question. But Cotton's diary ensures they at least have to ask it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the purpose of preserving these difficult histories isn't to provide answers, but to make sure future generations understand the weight of the questions. Cotton Jones died on Peleliu Beach on September 17, 1944. But his voice, preserved in ink and leather, and the testimony of those who refused to let his story be forgotten, still speaks. It asks us to remember that behind every casualty statistic is a person. Behind every military decision is a human cost. And behind every institutional narrative is a truth that someone decided was too inconvenient to share. His diary made sure that truth could no longer be hidden, and in doing so, honored not just his memory, but the memory of all who died in battles they weren't honestly prepared for, in wars they didn't fully understand, trusting institutions that sometimes valued strategy over their lives. The thunder of Peleliu's guns fell silent 80 years ago. But Cotton's whisper across decades still echoes, reminding us that trust, once broken, demands generations to heal, and that the cost of deception is paid not just by those who die, but by everyone who comes after, wondering if they too are being told less than the truth.